Divorce was the word that finally shattered the silence, short, brutal, and impossible to soften. For years it hovered at the edge of every interview, every public appearance, every carefully staged smile. And then, at last, Marco Borsato spoke. Not to accuse, not to seek sympathy, but to acknowledge the moment his marriage collapsed under a truth too heavy to carry alone. The separation from Leontine Reuters was not a sudden fracture. It was the end of a long, quiet erosion, a union stretched across years until it thinned to breaking. He described the divorce as a door closing without a sound. No shouting, no public spectacle, only the dull finality of realizing that what he believed to be unbreakable had already fallen apart. For a man whose voice once filled arenas, the silence at home was deafening. He admitted that the decision to leave was not driven by anger, but by exhaustion. The kind that comes from holding together a life that has been quietly untrue for far too long. Then came the confession that redefined everything. Marco revealed that betrayal had lived in the marriage for years, hidden behind routine and responsibility. The shock was not only in the infidelity itself, but in the realization that the children he had raised, protected, and loved as his own were not biologically his. The words arrived slowly, carefully chosen, as if each sentence might collapse under its own weight. He did not deny the pain. He allowed it to exist in the open, raw, and unadorned. He spoke of nights spent awake, replaying ordinary moments, school mornings, birthdays, quiet conversations, now transformed by a single devastating fact. Yet even as the truth cut deeply, Marco refused to erase the years he had given. He insisted that fatherhood, for him, had never been a matter of blood. Love, he said, is proven in presence, in sacrifice, in the willingness to stay when staying costs everything. Those children were his in every way that mattered to his heart, even as the truth threatened to rewrite the past. The betrayal by Leontine was not framed as villainy, but as a wound that demanded honesty. Marco acknowledged the complexity of shared years, the tenderness that once existed, and the sorrow of watching a partnership dissolve under secrets. He did not raise his voice, he lowered it. In doing so, he transformed accusation into reflection, turning personal devastation into a meditation on trust, identity, and the fragile architecture of marriage. As he recounted the moment he chose to walk away, Marco described a quiet clarity. Staying would have meant denying himself the dignity of truth. Leaving was not abandonment. It was an act of survival. He spoke of standing alone, stripped of illusions, discovering that even legends must relearn how to breathe after loss. The public saw a star breaking his silence. The man himself was simply learning how to live with honesty. In the absence of certainty, Marco found resolve. He refused to let bitterness define him, choosing instead to honor the love he had given freely, even if it had been built on a lie. His voice, once known for anthems of devotion, now carried a different power, one forged in vulnerability. And as the story unfolded, listeners were left not with scandal, but with the image of a man who had fallen hard against the truth, and chosen, quietly, to stand again, without applause, without vindication, and without pretending that the pain had an easy name. In the days after he finally spoke, Marco Borsato began noticing details he had ignored for years. The sound of the house in the early morning, too quiet, almost cautious. The way light crept across the kitchen table where 4 chairs still stood, untouched, as if waiting for a routine that would never return. He admitted that betrayal does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it enters softly, rearranging the air so slowly that you only realize you are suffocating when you try to breathe. He remembered tying shoelaces with hands that trembled slightly, pretending it was just age, just fatigue. He remembered school bags by the door, lunches prepared out of habit, love performed with precision, even as doubt lived somewhere deep, unnamed. Those were the moments that haunted him most. Not the arguments, not the headlines, but the ordinary gestures that now felt suspended between truth and illusion. When he spoke, his voice lingered on these details, inviting the listener to stand beside him in those rooms, to feel the weight of silence settling after each remembered breath. Marco described how the truth revealed itself not in a dramatic confession, but in fragments. A hesitation here, a look that stayed a second too long elsewhere, the growing awareness that certain questions were never answered directly. He spoke of intuition as something physical, an ache behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest, ignored for years because love often asks us to believe even when logic pleads otherwise. Listening to him, it was impossible not to feel that slow accumulation of doubt, the way it presses down gently until it becomes unbearable. He lingered on the moment he realized the children were not biologically his. Not the discovery itself, but the pause afterward, the suspended second where time seemed to stop. He recalled staring at his own reflection, searching for a face that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Yet even then, what rose first was not anger, but grief. Grief for a story he had lived wholeheartedly, for a role he had played with absolute sincerity. He spoke of holding memories like fragile glass, afraid that examining them too closely might cause them to shatter. There were nights, he said, when he would sit alone and replay lullabies sung off-key, scraped knees kissed better, long car rides filled with half-sung choruses. These memories did not lose their meaning with the truth. If anything, they became heavier, more sacred. Marco wanted the audience to understand that love does not retroactively disappear. What was real remains real, even when the foundation cracks. As he spoke, you could almost feel the warmth of those moments, tinged now with an unresolvable ache. He described the public silence as a second life he had to manage, smiling when expected, nodding through questions that never asked the right things, carrying the burden of a private collapse while the world continued to sing his songs. Fame, he said quietly, does not protect you from devastation. It only teaches you how to hide it better. In that confession, listeners could sense the exhaustion of a man who had performed strength for far too long. The decision to leave was marked by small, decisive acts, packing only what he needed, turning off lights one by one, standing in a doorway longer than necessary, committing the shape of a familiar space to memory. He spoke of that moment not as escape, but as acceptance. The acknowledgement that staying would mean losing himself entirely. The audience was not asked to judge, only to witness, to stand in that hallway with him and feel the weight of choosing truth over comfort. As Marco continued, his words slowed, almost deliberately. He allowed pauses to do the work sentences could not. In those pauses lived regret, tenderness, confusion, and a quiet determination to move forward without rewriting history to make it easier. He did not offer lessons or closure. Instead, he offered presence, an invitation to remain inside the story with him, to feel each detail, each breath, each unresolved emotion as it unfolded, unfinished, human, and painfully alive. As the days stretched on, Marco Borsato became increasingly careful with what he chose to say, and what he deliberately left unsaid. He admitted that truth, once released, does not arrive whole. It seeps out slowly, like light through a crack in a closed door. There were details he paused on, moments he circled without naming, as if revealing them too clearly might strip them of their meaning. Listeners sensed that the story he was telling had deeper rooms still locked, waiting. He spoke of conversations that never fully happened, of questions formed in his mind but never spoken aloud, suspended between fear and loyalty. Sometimes, he said, silence felt safer than clarity. Not because he wanted to protect anyone else, but because he was still unsure what protecting himself truly meant. In these moments, his voice softened, and the audience could feel the tension of a man standing between revelation and restraint. There were nights when sleep refused to come, when memories rearranged themselves without permission. Marco described waking suddenly, convinced he had heard a door close, only to find the house exactly as it was, unchanged, unmoving. Those false sounds lingered, symbolic of a life where endings rarely announce themselves clearly. He suggested that betrayal rarely has a single moment of discovery. Instead, it unfolds in fragments that only later assemble into something undeniable. He hinted at encounters that left him unsettled, a phrase overheard, a look exchanged too quickly, a realization that arrived late, long after it could have altered the outcome. He did not explain these moments fully, allowing them to exist as shadows at the edge of the narrative. And in doing so, he invited the audience to lean closer, to wonder how much of the truth remained buried beneath politeness, habit, and fear of collapse. Marco also spoke about time, how it stretches strangely after a revelation. Days moved forward, but emotionally he felt suspended, unable to decide whether to mourn what was lost or question what had ever truly existed. He described standing still while the world rushed past him, headlines appearing and disappearing, opinions forming without access to the quiet details that mattered most. The public wanted answers. He was still searching for the right questions. He refused to explain the precise moment when trust finally broke beyond repair. Instead, he framed it as a gradual fading, like music lowering in volume until one day you realize the song has ended. The absence was more powerful than any dramatic confrontation. By avoiding a clear breaking point, Marco left the audience with the uneasy understanding that some endings are invisible until long after they occur. There was also the matter of forgiveness, mentioned only briefly, almost reluctantly. Not as a conclusion, not as a goal, but as a distant concept he had not yet learned how to approach. He suggested that forgiveness without understanding felt premature, almost dishonest. And understanding, he implied, was still incomplete. In that admission, listeners sensed that reconciliation, of any kind, remained uncertain, unresolved, hovering somewhere beyond the present moment. As he continued, Marco's story began to feel less like a confession and more like an open corridor. Each sentence led somewhere, but never all the way. He acknowledged that some truths lose their power when explained too neatly. That mystery, however painful, sometimes preserves the dignity of what once was. And so he chose ambiguity, not as avoidance, but as honesty. By the time his voice quieted again, the audience was left standing inside that ambiguity with him. Nothing was fully explained, nothing entirely resolved. Only fragments, pauses, and the sense that behind every word spoken, there were others still waiting. Unready, unnamed, and deliberately left in the dark. As the narrative drifted closer to the present, Marco Borsato no longer spoke in straight lines. His memories began to loop, to overlap, to contradict one another in small, human ways. One moment he would describe a sense of relief, like finally setting down a weight he had carried too long, only to admit seconds later that the weight never truly leaves. It merely changes shape. The audience could feel that uncertainty settling in, not as confusion, but as something lived in and familiar. He spoke of mornings that began without urgency, coffee left untouched until it went cold, a phone that remained silent longer than expected. These were not dramatic absences, just subtle shifts that reminded him daily that his life no longer followed the rhythm it once had. And yet, within those quiet hours, he sometimes felt a strange clarity, as if emptiness itself could speak when noise finally stepped aside. There were moments when he questioned his own memories. Had certain conversations really happened the way he remembered them? Had love been mutual in the same way at the same time? He admitted that doubt does not only target the other person, it turns inward, dismantling certainty piece by piece. Listening to him, one could sense how fragile the past becomes once trust dissolves, how even happiness starts to feel provisional, conditional. Marco avoided describing the future directly. Instead, he circled around it, mentioning possibilities without naming them. Music still existed, he said, but differently now. Not as refuge, not as escape. More like a mirror, he approached cautiously. Some songs felt too close, others strangely distant, as if written by someone else. He did not say whether he would return fully to the stage, or whether silence might claim a more permanent role. The unanswered question lingered, unpressured, unresolved. He acknowledged the presence of forgiveness again, this time as something fluid, inconsistent. Some days it felt imaginable, other days it felt irrelevant. He suggested that healing does not follow a straight path, and that demanding resolution too early risks turning truth into performance. His voice carried no instruction, only observation, an invitation to sit with discomfort rather than rush past it. At one point, he described standing in a room he no longer lived in, surrounded by objects that had not moved. A jacket still hanging where it always had. A photo turned face down without explanation. He did not explain why he returned, or what he hoped to find. He only said that leaving a life does not mean it stops existing. Some places, he implied, continue quietly, waiting. As his words slowed further, the pauses grew longer. In those silences, listeners were left to fill the space themselves, with their own experiences, their own unanswered questions. Marco did not offer redemption, nor did he claim devastation as his identity. He remained suspended somewhere in between, not broken, not whole, not finished telling the story, and not entirely ready to stop. And so the narrative did not close. It simply softened, like a light left on in an empty room. No final declaration. No lesson neatly extracted. Only the sense that some truths, once spoken, do not conclude anything at all. They merely change the way silence feels afterward.